All right, let's jump right into today's explainer, because we are unpacking a truly fascinating piece of source material. It's an epistolary novel, a story told entirely through letters, called Nobody's Goblin Market. And it presents this deeply philosophical, frankly striking correspondence between Death himself and three of the most iconic female writers of the Victorian era. It's a completely unique lens on art, mortality, and isolation. Okay, let's dive into this. The central mystery here is just absolutely captivating. What actually happens when three legendary women push back against the ultimate inevitability? In this narrative, Death isn't just some abstract force. He's an articulate, deeply curious entity, and he finds himself totally perplexed by three women who didn't just resist him, they straight up refused him on their own terms.
So the text introduces Death as this sort of archivist of souls, and there's this incredible quote, "I keep a record of interesting refusals." Normally, right, Death expects bargaining, weeping, begging, the whole shebang, but he notes that three specific women rejected him before he even asked. This novelty just sparks an immortal's curiosity. It prompts him to read their hidden, unposted letters, and eventually, well, he starts writing back.
And this brilliantly illustrates the framework of our explainer today. We're looking at three brilliant minds, Emily Brontë, Christina Rossetti, and Emily Dickinson. Each of them lived in strict societal confinement, but each engineered a completely different type of reclusion and held a very distinct view of mortality. Let's explore these profiles.
Emily Brontë, wild surrender. So, we start with Emily out on the Yorkshire moors. Now, she isn't hiding in some stuffy parlor. She has this fierce, almost animalistic connection to the harsh landscape around her. Since she lost her mother and sisters at such a young age, she is deeply, intimately familiar with the smell and the shape of loss. She doesn't fear death at all. She just sees him as a constant guest at her family's table.
The narrative maps out Death's incredibly slow, agonizing approach to Emily. He literally creeps toward her. First, he takes the villagers, then her brother Branwell, then her sister Anne. He's slowly inching closer to Emily herself through the slow suffocation of consumption. But Emily? She stubbornly refuses to yield in a traditional coddled sick room. She absolutely despises the performative grief of doctors and medicines. Instead, she makes this fierce demand. "When you take me, I'll be standing." She literally challenges Death to meet her in a violent storm out on the moors like she's a character from her own novel. She demands to maintain her sovereignty and agency right to the very bitter end. She's completely refusing to bow.
But Death challenges her romanticized ideas. In Wuthering Heights, Brontë writes of lovers haunting the moors in this eternal, passionate torment. But Death gives her a much bleaker definition. He tells her haunting isn't some romantic reunion. It's just a repetition of a shape left behind, like a scratch in the record of the world that's just wearing itself out against a place.
This brings Brontë to a profound climax in their correspondence. She's faced with a massive choice, becoming the ghost or making the crossing. Do you cling to a place in eternal longing, or do you let go cleanly into the unknown? Ultimately, despite all her stubbornness, she chooses the clean crossing. True to her word, she dies standing up. And her very last words, they aren't to God or her sisters, but to her dog.
Christina Rossetti, Holy Starvation. Moving on to our second profile, Christina Rossetti in London. Her reclusion is entirely different from Emily's. Christina's battle isn't with the physical elements of a wild moor. It's this brutal, internal war of faith, desire, and strict religious devotion, all happening right in the middle of a bustling city.
The text beautifully highlights a really tragic dichotomy inside her. It's like a war between the saint and the goblin. On one hand, Christina meticulously performs the role of the saint. She's fasting, remaining pure, denying her flesh. But locked inside her is the goblin. That's her raw, deeply hungry self that is just desperate to taste the world. She locks away all that hunger just to maintain this flawless aesthetic of holiness. She literally weaponizes her religion to keep the world at bay. She tells Death, "I am promised to another." She uses this concept of a heavenly bridegroom to refuse ordinary life. She turns down perfectly good marriage proposals and denies herself any earthly pleasures. But privately, in her letters, she agonizes over whether this hunger is actually holy or she's just terrified of really living. So, the crucial point is Death's blunt diagnosis of her condition. He flat out tells her she's making an aesthetic out of refusal. She's using her extreme devotion as a mask to hide a deep fear of just being an ordinary woman who might be found wanting. She's turning deprivation into art, which Death frankly describes as slow suicide with sacraments.
It really forces us to ask a heartbreaking question. Is her life truly an act of holy devotion? When she publishes her masterpiece, Goblin Market, Victorian society reads it as this charming Christian allegory. But through the lens of this correspondence, we see it might actually be a desperate scream of starvation from a woman who has completely forgotten how to taste anything real.
Emily Dickinson, deliberate erasure. This leads us to our final profile, Emily Dickinson in Amherst, Massachusetts. Unlike Brontë, who saw death as an inevitable force of nature, or Rossetti, who tied him to her spiritual anxieties, Dickinson treats death like a gentleman caller, someone she can calmly sit down and negotiate with.
She offers death this highly calculated bargain. She writes, not mid-sentence, "Give me my mornings." She essentially promises to lock herself upstairs, wear white, and take up the absolute minimal amount of space in the physical world. In exchange, she just wants death to leave her alone long enough to finish her 700 ideas. She literally wants to capture eternity in language before she goes.
But Death points out the massive flaw in her logic. He defines completion as a purely mortal obsession. The universe simply doesn't allow for neat, tidy endings. In reality, everything stops mid-sentence. Her quest to perfectly capture the exact slant of light or the weight of silence in 14 lines, it's infinite. She will never technically be finished. As she begins speaking to visitors only through closed doors, Death issues a major warning. He contrasts solitude with isolation. Solitude is spacious, it's generative for her brilliant poetry, but isolation? That is a trap. It's fear masquerading as preference. He warns her that she is slowly erasing her physical self, essentially killing the woman in order to preserve the poet.
Which brings up this fascinating rhetorical question. Can you actually rehearse for death by disappearing? Dickinson actively chooses absolute nobodiness. She becomes a ghost in her own home while her heart is still beating. But Death reminds her that death isn't just absence, it's a very real threshold. Practicing disappearance doesn't prepare you for it. It just robs you of the life you have right now. The cost of art. Stepping back, we can synthesize the overarching narrative across these three incredible minds. The true theme here is the ultimate cost of art. Facing the incredibly restrictive gender rules of the 1800s, where their choices were basically limited to wife, mother, or spinster, these three women weaponized their reclusion. They built their own prisons to protect their art. Now, what's really interesting about this is Death's profound realization. He tells them, "You're all choosing me in slow motion while pretending you're choosing something else." Whether it was the wild moors, the internal convent, or the locked upstairs room, they were all choosing a form of death in life to escape the confines of their era. The source text basically reveals a brutal three-step formula these artists followed. Step 1, refuse the confines of an ordinary life. Step 2, channel that extreme hunger and isolation directly into legendary art. But Step 3 is the tragic catch. You pay the ultimate price of an unlived physical existence. They sacrifice the real world entirely for the page. Which leaves us deeply reflecting on one final provocative thought. Is immortality on the page actually worth the cost of disappearing from the world? It really forces us to examine our own lives, doesn't it? What do we sacrifice when we obsess over our legacies? Are we actually out there living, or are we just rehearsing? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you with something profound to chew on today.